Happy Wednesday! You're listening to Mama Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we're getting into part 4 of Caylee and Casey Anthony. Yeah, part 4. It is raining outside, and I'm trying really hard to let it ease off, but if I wait for that, I may sit in this building all day and not actually get to record anything. So maybe the rain will add like a little ambiance to the audio. I don't know, but there's not really a whole lot I can do. So, let's do a little recap of last week, and then we'll say let's get it. So last week in part 3 of Caylee and Casey Anthony, we covered the things that happened during the 31 days that Caylee was missing for, while Casey's mom, Cindy, was finally able to track Casey down. And after 2 911 calls and hours of waiting on responding officers to show up, Cindy made her third and final 911 call to let the dispatchers know that Casey had just admitted that Caylee was actually missing, and that the woman that Caylee had hired to be Caylee's nanny was the one who had taken Caylee and who had had her for the last 31 days. And naturally, with this new information, the responding officers put a little more pep in their step, and that's where I left y'all hanging. If you haven't already listened to the first 3 parts of this case, I would highly suggest going back and listening to those before you start this one, or you'll miss a lot of crucial information and details, and this episode may not make a whole lot of sense. So with that little recap in mind, let's jump right back in where we left off, and that would be the third and final 911 call that was made. So without further ado, let's get it. Police were, of course, in more of a hurry to get to the Anthony's home now that they had been informed that this was more than just a domestic family issue, and that there was a toddler who has actually been missing for 31 days already. And this is the first time that anybody's finding out that Caylee is actually missing. During the third 911 call, Casey doesn't sound worried. She even kind of sounds like annoyed and bothered by the fact that the dispatcher even wanted to speak to her at all. And I know last week that I purposely skimmed over the fact that during the third and final 911 call, Cindy tells the dispatcher that she'd just found Casey's car, and she even tells the dispatcher, quote, "It smells like there's been a dead body in the damn car." So this is someone besides Casey acknowledging that her car smells like literal death. And I know I brought it up last week, but Cindy's a nurse and George had worked in law enforcement. So they both knew what a dead body or a decomposing body would smell like. And I just don't see Cindy saying that the car smelled like a dead body had been in it if she didn't actually think it smelled like there had been a dead body in it. And also during this last 911 call, the dispatcher asked Casey why she didn't report Caylee missing 31 days ago when she actually went missing. And Casey tells her that she'd been looking for her on her own through her other resources, and then Casey tells the dispatcher that the nanny has Caylee. The nanny who I've just been calling Zanny the nanny this whole time. But the nanny's name was actually Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez. And here's a little spoiler alert for you to go ahead and blow your mind early on in this episode. Are you ready? Are you sure you're ready? Okay. Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, because Casey made sure to include the hyphen when spelling the name out for the dispatcher, doesn't exist. Casey doesn't know anybody at all by that name, but we'll get there. This case just pisses me off more and more and more every time I look into it. So when police officers do finally show up to the Anthony's home, they of course take statements from everybody, and meanwhile, Casey's texting her flavor of the month, Tony, and she tells him that Caylee's missing. But she also makes sure to tell Tony that if the police can't find Caylee, then she knows that she'll be the one that ends up spending the rest of her life behind bars for whatever might be happening to Caylee. So already at this point, Casey isn't worried about Caylee or Caylee's safety. She's more worried about what will happen to her if they don't find Caylee. And this makes me think that Casey already knows that they weren't going to find Caylee, which is why she would be worried about being locked up for murder. Duh. Like, I'm not even sure how a mom says that, but leave it up to Casey, right? So Casey sends somebody to get her things from Tony's place, since Cindy hadn't really given her time to get her stuff when she went to, like, force her to get in the car, when Casey's best friend Amy finally gave in and took Cindy to Tony's place, because Amy knew that that's where Casey had been hiding out from her family for the last month at. So once they get Casey's stuff from Tony's place, Cindy's kind of just going through all the bags that they'd gotten from Tony's place that belonged to Casey. And what would you know it, Cindy ends up finding a few of her own credit cards that Casey had stolen, along with a few $100 in cash, which we know that Casey didn't have a job, so how would she have cash? You guessed it, it was money that Casey had also stolen. So while Cindy's going through Casey's bags and finding all this stolen money and these stolen credit cards, the police are actually walking around Anthony's house getting statements from everybody. And Casey had already given her statement to one of the officers that showed up on the scene at the Anthony house. And then they bring in their big guns. They bring in a homicide detective. And this homicide detective was Detective Yuri. And Detective Yuri even gives Casey an out here. He tells her, like, hey, if you need to change anything from your statement earlier that, the officers took, or if you lied about anything, like, let's go ahead and change it and fix it now, and I'll get, like, a real statement. And Casey could have easily given up on her gig right then and told him the truth, but that's not really Casey's style. She'd rather try to lie her way out of it instead. So Casey tells him that in her first statement, everything she said was the truth. That's a lie. And this was just hours after the last 911 call was made, so not very long after everybody learned that Caylee was missing. All of this happened pretty quickly. Casey can even be heard on the recording from this interview telling Detective Yuri that everything that she'd told the officers already was the truth. And then Casey goes into, like, how she met Zanny the nanny and what happened on the supposed last day that she saw Caylee. So remember when Casey was telling her mom Cindy that she and Caylee were in Jacksonville visiting with Casey's ex-boyfriend Jeff? Remember, Jeff was the one who was paying to have Casey's car fixed in this lie that she made up. Okay, so according to Casey, Zanny had actually been the nanny for Jeff's kid. And she'd known Zanny for a few years now at this point. So she even has some, like, kind of elaborate backstory about how she met and knew Zanny and everything. So since Zanny had been such a good nanny for her ex-boyfriend Jeff's kid, Casey tells Detective Yuri that Zanny had been her nanny for Caylee for a few years now, and that Zanny had been Caylee's nanny since April of 2006. So right at 2 years already. So this is supposedly someone that Casey should have been able to trust with her daughter. But regardless, Casey says that she dropped Caylee off with Zanny, or Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, on June 9th. And she dropped Caylee off at Zanny's apartment. But Casey does tell Detective Yuri that Zanny had moved a few times since she had started watching Caylee. So, of course, the first stop for the police is going to be wherever Zanny the nanny is living now, so they can question her. Because, duh, that's how policing works. And Casey tells the detective that she spoke to a few different people about Caylee's disappearance. So, according to Casey, only a select few people knew that Caylee was missing. She says she spoke to her ex-boyfriend and current friend, Jeff, about it. But when the detective asked for Jeff's number to get in touch with him, to, like, verify that Casey had said something about Caylee being missing to Jeff, Casey says that she doesn't think she has Jeff's number saved in her cell phone. Which is weird because she just told Cindy, a week or two ago that she was in Jacksonville hanging out with Jeff. How'd you get in touch with Jeff then, Casey? Then the detective asked Casey if she had mentioned that Caylee was missing to anyone else, anybody. And Casey's like, you know what, Detective Yuri? I did talk about Caylee being missing to a coworker and friend named Juliette Lewis. And he's like, okay, so, how do you know Juliette? How do we get in touch with her? And she says, oh, I work with her at Universal Studios. So Detective Yuri asks Casey, like, okay, so you're still employed at Universal? And she's like, yeah, I'm still employed there. But Juliette just moved and her number changed and I don't have it saved in my phone. And I have 2 phones, a work phone and a personal phone. And I lost my phone, but I have my SIMS card. Like, you can just hear her lies unraveling through this entire interview. And we all know that Casey hasn't worked at Universal Studios since before Caylee was ever born 3 years prior. So there's that. Anyways, back to the last day that Casey claims to have seen Caylee alive. Casey tells Detective Yuri that she dropped Caylee off with Zanny the nanny on June the 9th, that she went to work at Universal Studios as per usual, and Casey says that she worked her normal shift at work, and that when she got off of work at Universal, she left work and she headed to the Sawgrass Apartments, where Zanny lived, to pick Caylee up. And this is where her story gets a little weird, because Casey says that when she knocked on Zenaita's door to pick Caylee up, no one answered the door. And for anybody who might be lost right now, Zanny the nanny and Zenaita are the same person. I'm just interchanging the names now. So Detective Yuri asks, what did Casey do after nobody came to the door when she went to pick Caylee up that day? And Casey tells the detective that she tried to call Zenaita a few times with no luck, but every time that Casey tried to call Zenaita's number, the number wasn't in service anymore. And Casey does try to justify this claim by saying that Zanny had moved a lot and that she'd changed her number pretty frequently and that she didn't really think much about it at first. So Casey claims that when no one answered the door for her to pick Caylee up, that she wasn't really worried yet or panicked, that she just thought this was like a fluke with Zanny's number. So Casey just sat on the stairs of the apartment building that Zanny lived in and waited on Zanny the nanny to show back up with Caylee. And Casey says that after she sat on the stairs at this apartment building where Zanny lived for an hour or longer, that she did finally start to get worried. So Casey tells Detective Yuri that she left the apartment building and that she started searching any of the regular places that she knew Zanny had taken Caylee to before, like specific playgrounds or parks or things like that. But Casey claims that she still didn't have any luck finding Zanny or Caylee after checking all these places that she could think to look. So this is when Casey starts telling the detective that she never told anyone that Caylee was missing except for her ex-boyfriend and friend Jeff and her friend and co-worker Juliette Lewis. Casey says that she never even told her boyfriend Tony about Caylee being missing. And Casey is still sticking to her lie about not having a good number for Detective Yuri to be able to reach Jeff or Juliette. So that's just convenient. And now Casey's just confusing the detective because she's claiming that she has two separate phones. One's for work and one's for her personal phone, but her personal phone is lost and she can't find it. But that she also has the SIMS card out of her personal phone, just not the actual phone, to be able to give them any numbers that they need. And then there's a whole lie that Casey has about why she has a SIMS card to her personal phone, but not the actual phone. Like, she's been trying to figure out how to save all these numbers out of her phone from one phone to the next, and yada, yada, yada. Casey even tells this detective that she filed an incident report just 9 days ago, actually, at work with Universal Studios about her phone either being stolen or misplaced at work. Did y'all forget that this bitch does not actually have a job? I hope not, because I have been harping on her not having a job this entire time. Like, this is the longest, most nonsensical lie I have ever heard in my life. And Casey will always lie. She can't stop, won't stop. Like, I don't... So, you can see how this already don't make no damn sense. Okay, right? Okay. So, as long as we're all on the same page, Casey claims that after she couldn't find Zenaita or Caylee anywhere, that instead of going home, she felt like it would be safer for her to go stay at her boyfriend Tony's place. And finally, the detective asked Casey why the hell she would wait so long to report Caylee as a missing child. And this always kind of bugs me too, though, because all the media outlets at the time that this all happened, like, the headlines all said something along the lines of, Mom waited 31 days to report her daughter missing. And that's not the case whatsoever. Casey never reported Caylee missing. Cindy did. Let that sink in. Like, I know you know that, but then when you really think about it, it's like, damn, she was never going to tell anybody, huh? So when Detective Yuri asked Casey why she waited so long to report Caylee missing, Casey tells him that she was scared about what might happen to Caylee if police got involved. And at this point, this detective has to be, like, mind blown with the amount of lies that he's trying to cipher through during this interview. So he takes Casey home and he drops her off at her house where she lives with Cindy and George. And Detective Yuri spends the next few hours doing his job, running down leads, looking for all these people who Casey had mentioned, and picking through her lies to find little bits of the truth. When Detective Yuri finds that all of these addresses that Casey claimed that Zanny had lived at and moved to, he's looking into it and finding out that no one by that name had ever lived in any of these places. Detective Yuri also finds that the apartments in the Sawgrass apartment complex where Casey said that Zanny was living the last time she dropped Caylee off, that apartment had never been rented to anyone by that name, and that specific apartment number had been empty for months. So once Detective Yuri figures out that all of this was just one big lie, he also starts digging into everything else that Casey said. Because according to Casey, she had met her ex-boyfriend Jeff at Universal Studios, and they had been working together. Casey said that she'd also met her friend and co-worker Juliette Lewis at Universal Studios also. And Casey had even said at one point that Zanny the Nanny, or aka Zenaida, had worked at Universal Studios for a time too. And remember, for context, the ex-boyfriend Jeff and Juliette, the co-worker, are supposedly the only two people that Casey ever told about Caylee being missing. So Detective Yuri decides that it's probably a good idea to have Casey show him where her office is. And while they were there, Casey could show the detective where Zanny, Jeff, and Juliette had also worked. This would just kind of help move things along with the investigation, if they could cross off all of these different people in one place of employment. So Detective Yuri and Casey head off to Universal Studios so that Casey can show him where her office is and show them, where everybody else worked. And once Casey and Detective Yuri get to the, employee security gate, Casey gives the security guard her name and information. And after he looks her up in the system, the security basically says, I'm sorry, but no one by that name works here. Which is red flag number, 5,000 now? Okay, just making sure we're keeping count. But Casey insists that this has to be a mistake, that he needs to check again. And Casey even goes further as to give this guard a name of her supervisor, whose name is also not in the system as an employee. Casey doesn't give up that easily, though, because no, absolutely not Casey Anthony. And eventually the detective has to, talk to the head of security and get the okay to walk Casey through the park since they were there looking for a missing child. And, Detective Yuri promises the head of security that they will accompany Casey the entire time. And finally, the detective gets the okay to walk Casey through the park, but only if some of the security guards that work at Universal Studios can walk with Casey and the detectives. They agree to this for the sake of a missing kid. And I swear these detectives already knew Casey was lying through her teeth, and they just wanted to see how far she would take her own lies. So now Casey is legitimately walking through the hallways of Universal Studios, waving at people, saying hey to people, asking about people's kids and hey, how's your mama and them doing? Talking to complete strangers like they'd been best friends for years. And when I say that Casey doesn't stop, I mean she does not stop. So after Casey had walked these detectives and a few of the security guards from Universal Studios around the entire park, Casey finally makes a turn down a hallway and it leads to a dead end. Now, once Casey hits this dead-end hallway, she finally turns around and tells the detective and the security from Universal, okay, so I don't actually work here? She had them walking around this entire park in the middle of the summer in Florida heat and humidity for who knows how long, just to lead them down a dead-end hallway and tell them that she doesn't actually work here. I'm sorry, what? So now the detectives are understandably pissed, and Universal Studios even agrees to let the detectives borrow a space to interview Casey again, because at this point, these detectives are so done with Casey and all of the bullshit that she spouts off. Because at this point, she's just wasting their time. They're trying to help her find her daughter. They're the ones busting their ass, following these addresses and tracking down people's names and places of employment and, residency history. And all of it's been a lie. They've wasted so many hours already and it's only day, 2? And she's the reason they're wasting all this time. It's not like they're going down the wrong, they're tunnel visioned and focused on the wrong thing. No, they're going off of exactly what Casey said, which was just all a lie. So during this interview, the detectives are obviously going a little bit harder and getting a little bit more aggressive in their line of questioning than they had been the first time or two when they'd interviewed her before. Because like I just said, detectives had just spent hours walking around Universal Studios looking for Casey's office where she worked. Like, they're just already over the lies that are Casey Anthony. And Detective Yuri comes flat out and basically says, like, I'm pretty sure that everything that you told me so far has been a lie. And then Detective Yuri even says, like, this is going to be your escape hatch, so you need to speak. You need to stop feeding us lies, and you need to tell us the truth and explain what's going on so we can help you as much as we possibly can. And eventually, Detective Yuri tells Casey something along the lines of, like, everything you've said thus far has been a lie. And I'm fairly confident that you actually do know where Caylee is. And Casey just keeps on with the, I don't actually know where she is. Like, I don't know who has her. I don't know if she's okay. And he tells her, like, no, I think you definitely do know where she is. And this is when the detective finally drops the bombshell and tells Casey, no one has lived in the apartment that you claim that Zanny lived in for months. He also tells Casey that he had already checked the work history of all the people that she claimed had worked at Universal Studios with her. And he tells her, like, Jeff, Juliet, Zanny, all of these people either never worked at Universal Studios or they were fired or quit years and years ago. So he's basically just letting her know that he knows that everything that she said so far has been a lie and that she wasn't really fooling him. And I'm going to link these interviews in the show description or the show notes below where the episode is. If y'all have time or if you're interested, please go listen to these because they are so telling as far as how manipulative and deceitful Casey is and how quickly and easily she does it. So Detective Yuri basically tells Casey, like, you've given me, the one person who is actually out looking for your child, all of these fake addresses, all of these fake places, the fake job that I'm supposed to be looking into, all of these fake people. How am I supposed to help you find your daughter with so much of this being misinformation? And of course, Casey has absolutely no good reasoning or answer for any of this. And then he even goes on to bring up how Casey supposedly knew that her daughter was missing, how she didn't call the police, and how instead she even purposely dodged people and situations where someone might ask where Caylee was for more than a month. And Detective Yuri even throws up the fact that Casey wasn't the one that even called police to start with, even after the 31 days of Caylee being missing. He brings up how it was actually Casey's mom, Cindy, and Caylee's grandma, who was the one that eventually called police after Cindy played detective to figure out what the hell was really going on. So the detectives get Casey back to the police station, and they know they need to figure out some way to keep her there. So they arrest her on, like, child endangerment and a few smaller charges like that. So she was arrested on July 15th, 2008, and I shit you not, Casey's calls from jail are absolutely ridiculous. They will blow your mind. When Casey first calls home, she doesn't want to talk to anyone about Caylee or, like, what's going on. She instead just immediately starts cussing Cindy out about TV interviews that she'd done since Casey had been arrested. Because Cindy was actually trying to spread awareness about Caylee being missing in hopes that somebody would help find her. They had already missed the most crucial 48-hour mark. It's now been more than a month since Caylee was last seen by anyone. But instead of being worried about the progress in Caylee's case, Casey just cusses Cindy out and then, like, asks to speak to her brother Lee. When Casey's brother Lee gets on the phone, the only reason that Casey even wanted to talk to Lee is because she knew that Lee would have her boyfriend Tony's number. So Lee just kind of tells her how he really feels, but he doesn't give her Tony's phone number. And Lee eventually passes off the phone to one of Casey's lifelong friends, Christina. And Christina asks Casey if Tony had anything to do with where Caylee is. And Casey just sounds, like, appalled by this question. And basically, you know, of course, she says he doesn't have anything to do with Caylee being missing. So Christina asks a really good question when she asks Casey if Tony doesn't have anything to do with Caylee being missing, then why are you worried about talking to Tony right now? Your daughter is actually missing. Actually, I'm going to try to play the jail call. Let me see if I can pull it up on my computer right quick. I'm going to try to play the call for you because it is ridiculous.
Casey?
Mom.
Hey, sweetie.
Oh, I just saw your nice little cameo on TV.
Which one?
What do you mean, which one?
Which one? I did 4 different ones, and I don't know. I haven't seen them all. I've only seen 1 or 2 so far.
You don't know what my involvement is and stuff?
Casey?
Mom.
What?
No.
I don't know what your involvement is, sweetheart. You're not telling me where she's at.
Because I don't fucking know where she's at. Are you kidding me?
Casey, don't waste your call.
No.
Scream and holler at me.
Waste my call sitting in, the jail?
Whose fault
where bunks are?
Whose fault is you're sitting in the jail? You're blaming me that you're sitting in the jail?
Not
Blame
my
yourself
fault.
for telling lies. You mean it's not your fault? What do you mean it's not your fault, sweetheart? If you'd have told them the truth and not lied about everything, they wouldn't...
Do me a favor, just tell me what Tony's number is. I don't want to talk to you right now. Forget it.
I don't have his number.
We'll get it from Lee because I know Lee's at the house. I saw Mallory's car was out front. It was just on the news. They were just live outside the house.
I know they were.
Well, can you get Tony's number for me so I can call him?
Hey?
Hey, can you give me Tony's number?
I can do that. I don't know what real good it's going to do at this point.
Well, I'd like to talk to him anyway.
Okay.
Because I called to talk to my mother, and it's a fucking waste. Oh, by the way, I don't want any of you coming up here when I have my first hearing for bond and everything else. Like, don't even fucking waste your time coming up here.
You know, you're making it real tough for anybody to want to try to, even if she was giving you somebody's phone number.
Every single
You're not even letting me finish.
Well, Let's go ahead.
You're asking me for Tony's phone number so you can call him, and then you immediately want to start cussing towards me and saying, don't even worry about coming up here for all this stuff and trying to cut us out.
I'm not trying to cut anybody out.
I'm not going around and around with you. You know, that's pretty pointless. I'm not going to put everybody else through the same stuff that you've been putting the police and everybody else through for the last 24 hours and the stuff you've been putting Mom through for the last 4 or 5 weeks. I'm done with that. So you can tell me what's going on. Christina would love to talk to you because she thinks that you will tell her what's going on. Frankly, we're going to find out. Whatever's going on, it's going to be found out. So why not do it now?
There's nothing to find out. There's absolutely nothing to find out. Not even what I told the detective.
Well, you know, everything
I have
she's
no
telling them
clue where
is a
Caylee is.
lie.
If I knew where Caylee was, do you think any of this would be happening? No.
Anyway, you only got a couple minutes with us, so I'm not going to let you completely waste it. Here's Christina. She thinks she can get through.
No, I want Tony's number. I'm not talking to anybody else.
Hello?
Hi, I'm glad everybody's at my house. I'll have to call you later. I'll have to call somebody to get your number. Do me a favor, get my brother back because I need Tony's number.
Okay, is there anything I can do for you?
I'm sitting in jail. There's nothing anybody can do right now.
Oh, I'm just trying to be...
Oh, I know you are, honey. I absolutely know that you are, and I appreciate everything that you're trying to do, but I'd like to call Tony. He's not at my house, is he?
No,
Okay.
no, it's just me and your parents and Lee.
Okay. Well, can you do me a favor and get my brother back or get the number from him, please?
Does Tony have anything to do with Caylee?
No. Nothing.
Okay, so why do you want to talk to Tony? You probably don't want to tell me, do you?
Huh?
You probably don't want to tell me, do you?
I didn't hear what you said.
I said, does Tony have anything to do with Caylee?
No, Tony had nothing to do with Caylee.
Oh, so why do you want to talk to him? You probably don't want to tell me.
He's my boyfriend, and I want to actually try to sit and talk to him because I didn't get a chance to talk to him earlier because I got arrested on a fucking whim today because they're blaming me for stuff that I never would do, that I didn't do.
Okay. Well, I'm on your side, you know that,
Oh,
right?
honey, I know that. I just want to talk to Tony and get a little bit of...
Casey, you have to tell me if you know anything about Caylee.
Sweetheart,
if anything happens to Caylee, Casey, I'll die. You understand? I'll die. If anything happens to that baby.
Oh my God. Calling you guys? A waste. Huge waste. Honey, I love you. You know I would not let anything happen to my daughter. If I knew where she was, this wouldn't be going on.
Well, how come everybody's saying you're lying?
Because nobody's fucking listening to anything that I'm saying. The media completely misconstrued everything that I said. The fucking detectives told them fucking bullshit. They got all of their information from me, yet at the same time, they're twisting stuff. They've already said they're going to pin this on me if they don't find Caylee. They've already said that.
Well,
they arrested me because they said that...
Yeah, because they said that the person that you dropped Caylee with doesn't even exist.
Because, oh, look, they can't find her in the Florida database. She's not just from Florida.
And there was more to that call, but I feel like you get the point. She isn't worried about a single thing besides calling Tony. And Casey's poor friend Christina is just like, does Tony have anything to do with Caylee being missing? And Casey's like, no, of course not. And you can actually hear it in her friend's voice, like she's shocked. Like, so why are you worried about talking to him? If it doesn't pertain to Caylee, why are you worried about it? Which is a valid point. And then Casey's poor friend just breaks down and she completely starts bawling. And she's like, if anything happens to Caylee, I'll die. If anything happens to that baby, I will die. And Casey just chimes in with like, oh my God, calling you guys is such a waste. Like, ooh, shut up, bitch. Nobody likes you. Okay, so she goes on about how she wants to talk to her boyfriend because, you know, he is her boyfriend and she didn't get a chance to talk to him before she was arrested. I feel like this call just shows like where her headspace was at, and it is not where it should have been. Like, Casey is worried about everything except for the one person who she should be worried about. So while Casey is sitting in jail, I'm sure you can hear the lawnmower in the background. If you've been here a while, you know that I have a little old lady neighbor that loves to ride her lawnmower, even when she's not cutting grass. She says it helps with her cancer pain, so I don't complain. So if you hear it, I'm sorry. It is what it is. So while Casey is sitting in jail, police are like tearing Florida apart looking for this Zanny the nanny who was supposedly last seen with Casey. And lo and behold, they do find a woman living in Orlando, Florida by the name of Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez. But when police show up at Zenaida's door to ask her about Casey and where Caylee is, they're not exactly shocked to learn that Zenaida had never even heard of Casey or Caylee Anthony. She'd never met either one of them. She didn't know any people even by the name of Casey or Caylee. And she doesn't even know any of the people that Casey listed that were supposedly associated with Zenaida. So all of the people that Casey had claimed that knew Zenaida and like people that Casey had claimed introduced her to Zenaida had never met or heard of any of these people. And it didn't take police long to figure out that Casey had just pulled this name out of thin air and that it was just a complete coincidence that Casey had picked this name. So let me pause in the timeline here to say this, because remember when Caylee was leaving the house the last time that George says that he had seen Caylee alive, and that was when Caylee had told George that she was going to see Zanny the nanny. This makes me kind of mad to think about, because as we all know now, Zanny isn't a real person. I mean, she is, but she isn't a person who knew Caylee or Casey, or a person who Casey and Caylee knew. Like, either way, they did not know each other. And so it's not like Caylee had met Zanny before and like she was excited to go back and see her. This is someone that Caylee would have never met. So what toddler do you know that just walks around listing random Hispanic names of people that they're planning to go see that they've never met before. This really makes me believe so bad that Casey either taught or coached Caylee into telling George that she was going to see Zanny the Nanny. Especially since Caylee had never met a Zanny the Nanny before. You know what I mean? Like, how did Caylee just come up with this idea to tell her grandpa George that she was going to see Zanny the Nanny if she'd never met Zanny the Nanny before? This had to be something that someone told her to say, and no one besides her mom, Casey, knew anything about this nanny. So it really couldn't have been anybody else. That really just pisses me off. It's almost like premeditation so far in advance. This Zanny the Nanny was coming up in conversations months before Caylee ever was missing. So Zenaida is a real person, just not the person that Casey was claiming that she was. So just a few days after Casey was arrested, the police took the car that Casey's parents had been nice enough to let Casey use like it was her own, and that white Pontiac Sunfire was taken into evidence to be searched. Now, Casey's still sitting in jail when they're taking her car into custody, so she can't control the narrative in this particular situation. And the police go ham on Casey's car. Like, they were able to pull carpet fibers and strands of hair from the trunk of Casey's car. And, of course, they swabbed the entire car, inside, outside. I think they even did the tires, looking for any other kind of evidence. Police even went back to the impound lot and got the trash that George had thrown out with the moldy, maggoty filled pizza. Yeah. And they did that because it had been in Casey's car, and they wanted to see if they could pull any evidence off of anything in those bags that may give them any clues or leads as to where they should be looking next. And after so much DNA was collected from Casey's car, Casey's mom, Cindy, and her dad, George, and even Casey's brother, Lee, who we haven't really talked much about in this series, they all gave their DNA voluntarily to be able to, rule them out of, certain situations and circumstances. Now, during the testing of some of this trash that was pulled from Casey's trunk to be tested, there was fatty acid found on a paper towel that is often referred to as grave wax, which is common in places where decomposing bodies are found. But of course, during the trial, there are other experts that will say that fatty acids or grave wax is also commonly found on certain foods. So, who knows which where the grave wax is actually from? Was it from the, rotten food with maggots in it found inside of Casey's trunk? Or was there actually a decomposing body in her trunk? Now, investigators were also able to take strands of the human hair that they found in the trunk of Casey's car, and once the hairs were examined, they were found to be extremely similar to the hair found in Caylee's hairbrush. But investigators were never able to prove with absolute certainty that any of these human that any of these human hair strands found actually belonged to Caylee. But there was something else that was found on these strands of hair that were recovered from the trunk of Casey's car. These human strands of hair also had dark bands around the ends of them, which is typically called a death banding, and it happens around the root of the hair. And this death banding is only ever found on the root of hairs that have been removed from a decomposing body. The hairs with the death banding also match the hairs that had been recovered from Caylee's hairbrush as well. And the hair from the trunk of Casey's car and the hair that had been pulled from Caylee's hairbrush were both basically what I call virgin hair. In other words, virgin hair is hair that has never been colored or bleached or permed. Basically, nothing at all as far as chemicals or treatments goes had ever been altered or done to the hair found. Which I don't know very many 2 or 3-year-olds with bleached or dyed hair, so there's that. And Casey and Cindy had both had some kinds of treatments done to their hair, so that really only leaves Caylee's hair as an option for whose hair this could be. Now, speaking of chemicals and shit, these investigators went to the absolute extreme while they were testing shit that was in the trunk of Casey's car. The investigators even went so far as to test the air quality inside of Casey's trunk. Yes, you heard me right. they tested the air in the trunk of Casey's car. Don't ask me how. That doesn't even make sense to me, but they did it. I know they did it. I seen it in the trial. And during this air quality testing, there were traces of gasoline and even chloroform found in the air quality of the trunk of Casey's car. Now, along with the gasoline and chloroform, there were also 7 other components that were significant in the process of decomposition that were found during the air quality testing also. So all of this evidence that's been found so far has all come from the trunk of Casey's car. And, this on top of all of her lies and running the detectives around Universal Studios for a day, it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good at all. Then cadaver dogs were brought in, and these dogs are specifically trained to locate the smell of human remains. They are trained to smell dead bodies or decomposing bodies or places where dead or decomposing bodies have been. So the first time the cadaver dogs were brought in, they were searching the inside and the outside of Casey's car. During this search, the cadaver dogs hit on the fact that they did, in fact, find a smell of a dead or decomposing body inside of the Pontiac Sunfire that Casey drove daily. And then on the very next day, Cindy and George both agreed to let investigators bring those same cadaver dogs inside of the Anthony house where Casey and Caylee had always lived with Cindy and George. And yet again, the cadaver dogs alerted to the smell of a dead or decomposing body in the backyard area of the Anthony house near Caylee's plastic toy playhouse that she was known to play in pretty frequently. But these investigators knew that this would be a good thing to probably double check, especially if they were trying to build a case that was strong enough to eventually take to trial. So that's what they did. Investigators brought in a second round of trained cadaver dogs just to double check the first dog's work. But the second dog was also hitting on the same exact spots that the first dog had. So now with 2 separate trained cadaver dogs who were handled by 2 separate trained officers, we're both hitting on the playhouse area in the backyard of the Anthony house for a dead or decomposing body and in the car that Casey drove every day. Both dogs, both same spots. That's unlikely if there wasn't a dead body there at some point or another. And since both of these dogs had hit on the backyard area of the Anthony's house, investigators start digging that area up. This was probable cause enough to start searching, the grounds near where the 2 dogs had hit on the smell of the dead body. And unfortunately, those searches and digging up the Anthony's backyard didn't really lead to anything of substance. They found absolutely nothing in the backyard anywhere near where the cadaver dogs had hit on the smell at. So on July 18th, 2008, Casey hires an attorney that would inevitably get her off scot-free. Her attorney's name was Jose Baez. And I know for all of us true crime-obsessed oddballs, the name Jose Baez is pretty well known in the true crime community, and especially in the true crime podcasting genre. But back in 2008, when Casey hired Jose, he was basically a nobody. And that's probably the nicest thing I can think to say about him probably ever. But how was Casey paying Jose Baez to represent her? Because she didn't have a job, and Casey's parents, Cindy and George, are both pretty well convinced that Casey at least knows more than what she's saying, so I highly doubt they're forking over the money for a lawyer. But we'll get into the speculation of how Casey may or may not have allegedly paid Jose Baez to represent her in her future court endeavors. We'll get there later on. For now, let's stick to the timeline. Y'all, now I have 2 neighbors cutting grass and somebody's big old dog is going crazy. If y'all hear it in the background, I'm sorry. If I don't do this today, y'all ain't getting an episode this week. So we're going to have to deal with the background noise this week. I don't know what else to do. So on July 22nd, Casey went for her bond hearing. The part where the judge decides if someone can pay a certain amount of money to get out of jail, and they basically just get out of jail and wait for their trial to start. Now, during this bond hearing on July 22nd, both of Casey's parents, Cindy and George, have to take the stand and recount the last time that they recalled seeing their granddaughter Caylee alive. And they're both obviously upset and distraught, and they don't know which way is up and which way is down. The courts even call Casey's brother Lee to the stand, and this is basically just everyone in Casey's immediate family asking the court to let Casey be released on bond. So Cindy, George, and Lee were all asked the same thing, and they were all asked basically if they thought they were given more time alone with Casey, if they thought that they would be able to get more information from Casey about where Caylee was. And all three of them answered that they thought that they could find the truth if they had more alone time with Casey, which just blows my mind because she already lied to them all for so long. What difference would another few hours, days, or even weeks matter? I don't think it would. But all of their pleas and cries, none of that really worked because with all the evidence that they had already found, and the cadaver dog sitting on Casey's car and in the backyard of Anthony's home, it was on this same day on July 22nd that Casey would be named as a person of interest in the disappearance of her daughter Caylee. The judge was basically like, that's a no for me, dog. She hasn't helped with anything in this case. She's actually tried to hide and deter the investigators from finding the truth in this case so she could stay her ass in jail. That wasn't a quote, but it should have been. And there has been, some small evidence found in the case at this point, but not really enough for a judge to not give Casey a bond. So, what does he do? The judge sets Casey's bail at $500,000. And that just tells me that the judge thought that the shit that had been found was disturbing enough that he didn't want her anywhere near the outside world. So he didn't want to refuse her bond, he just wanted to make it high enough that he didn't think she would be able to get out. Because that is a really high bond. But it's a bond nonetheless. So a $500,000 bond, and then during this bond hearing, the judge says my most favorite thing ever, ever, ever at the end. He says, quote, "The truth and Miss Anthony are strangers." Which, again, is my favorite quote of all time in regards to this case. The judge knows that Casey doesn't have that kind of money and that no one trusts her enough to let her borrow that kind of money. But just for good measure and just to cover all his bases, the judge said that if, for some unknown reason, that Casey was able to make her bond, that she would have to wear a tracking ankle monitor while she was out of jail waiting for her trial to start. The judge then does another really smart thing on his part, and he orders Casey to be evaluated to make sure that she's competent enough to stand trial. Because obviously, Casey has been known to do some shit that sane, competent people would not do. And basically, the judge was like, I think she might be a psychopath, but let's check and see. And I'm aware that that's not actually how that's not actually how they figure that out. That wasn't me, targeting psychopaths. That was me saying that Casey's ass is crazy, and it is what it is. But I feel like after everybody saw, where her mental state was, I don't know, she's not acting like she's mentally, she's unbothered by her daughter being missing and not having any idea where she's at. She never really shows emotion up until it has something to do with Casey and what Casey was feeling and what Casey's future might hold. But no real emotion when it came to her missing toddler, Caylee. And after Casey was evaluated, she was found to be completely competent to stand trial, which I still think they should probably retest her. She's a crazy one. And every kind of mental health testing that you can think of was done on Casey, and everything came back completely normal. Nothing that they could find to say that Casey wasn't in a good enough spot mentally or otherwise to be able to stand trial. And I don't remember if I mentioned it or not, but the charges on Casey at this point are smaller charges, like child neglect and filing false police reports or something like that. And now I get that child neglect is not a small charge, but compared to murdering your child, it is. So for her charges, a $500,000 bond is outrageously high. And it wasn't even for the murder of Caylee or Caylee being missing. It was for child neglect. Because, of course, at this point in the timeline, Caylee is just missing. There hasn't been anything found to determine that Casey wasn't alive yet. Not with where we are in the timeline right now. Because right now, we're still in the month of July, which is the same month that Cindy finally called 911 to report Caylee missing. So this is just the days and weeks after Casey was arrested. Just shortly after Caylee was finally reported missing to law enforcement. I just wanted to clear that up so that I know that we're all on the same page. So it was either the day of or the day after Casey's bond hearing, where her bail was set to $500,000, that Casey's ex-best friend Amy came in to formally press charges on Casey for stealing all those checks and cash that Casey had spent when she'd emptied Amy's bank account while Amy was on vacation. And I guess I should probably say that, yeah, it was her ex-best friend at this point. So on July 25th, Jose Baez tries to strike up an immunity deal for Casey Anthony. So what would she need immunity for if she didn't do anything to harm her or kill her missing daughter? That's right, she wouldn't really need immunity for anything. And yet here her lawyer is asking for an immunity deal. That's weird, that's suspicious. So on this same day, July 25th, Cindy and George go to visit Casey in jail for the first time. And I want to play the audio from that first jail visit because I think it says a lot also. But we're almost an hour in. It is 6 o'clock and I still have to go get stuff to cook for dinner. So we'll pick it back up next week. I really thought next week would be the last one. It may be 3 hours long next week, but it will be the last one, I promise. Lord, I shouldn't make promises I can't keep. Okay, I will try my very, very, very best to make next week's episode the last one on Casey Anthony for a while. I still want to cover the Peacock documentary, but we can do that later on down the road after we get off of her for a little while. I'm kind of sick of talking about her, if I'm being honest. So, go check out everything on the socials. You can connect with me there. On Facebook and TikTok, you can search Mama Murdered a Podcast. And on Instagram and Twitter, you can search murdered_mama. And I think that's all I have for you this week. I'm sorry about the background noise. And you may get this a day early because I had to record it a few days early. I don't know. We'll see. But anyway, either way, let's do it again. Same time, same place. Next Wednesday. I'll see y'all then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.